When Sidney Lumet, the legendary director of 12 Angry Men and Dog Day Afternoon, passed away, his townhouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side sat empty for months. It was a modest brownstone compared to Hollywood mansions, but it had history, decades of film scripts, late-night editing sessions, and heated arguments over art and morality had seeped into its walls. When the property finally went on the market, a young couple, Alex and Marissa, saw it as their chance to own a piece of cinematic history. They moved in, expecting charm and inspiration. Instead, they found unease. From their first night, something was wrong. The old radiator clanged more than it should, but what disturbed Marissa most was the faint sound of voices muffled, like arguments in another room. She assumed it was neighbors. Yet when she pressed her ear to the wall, the voices seemed to come from inside the house. Alex dismissed it as the quirks of an old building. A few weeks later, while storing boxes in the basement, Alex found a stack of dusty film canisters and notebooks left behind. They weren't studio-labeled reels but unlabeled, personal recordings. Out of curiosity, he set up an old projector one night. The film wasn't a movie, it was footage of Lumet himself, pacing, muttering about morality, guilt, and truth. The reel cut to black, then flickered back with Lumet staring straight into the camera, silent, as if he knew someone decades later would be watching. That night, the voices upstairs grew louder. Neighbors began asking strange questions. An older man who had lived on the block for years asked Marissa, "Do you ever see him at the window?" She thought he meant burglars. "No," he clarified. "The man in the white shirt always looks like he's waiting for an answer." She laughed nervously, but her smile faded when she realized the man was describing Sidney Lumet himself, right down to the rolled-up sleeves. The disturbances grew personal. Lights dimmed during dinner. Script pages, those old notebooks, were found scattered across the floor even when locked away. The couple woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of heavy breathing in their bedroom, but no one was there. One night, Alex swore he saw a figure standing in the hallway mirror, not behind him but inside the reflection, arms crossed, watching, as if judging. The final straw came when Marissa invited a friend over, a sound technician who had worked on films. Curious about the supposed voices, he set up recording equipment in the basement. When they played it back, the static slowly formed words. A man's voice, calm and measured, said, "Tell the truth." It was Sidney Lumet's lifelong mantra, the core of his filmmaking. The technician refused to come back. Within weeks, Alex and Marissa left the house, breaking their lease early. The brownstone sits on the market again, quietly advertised but hard to sell. Locals say the lights still flicker on at odd hours, and if you stand outside at night, you might catch a glimpse of a man at the window, arms crossed, waiting for someone to get the story right. The days that followed the recording in the basement were marked by a quiet unease that clung to the house like damp air. Alex and Marissa tried to convince themselves that it had all been a coincidence, that the static forming words was nothing more than their minds trying to make sense of random noise. But the weight of what they had heard stayed with them, coloring every creak of the stairs, every hum of the radiator, every flicker of shadow on the wall. In the evenings, Marissa would sit in the living room with a book, though she rarely made it through a page. She found herself glancing toward the tall windows, where the street lamps outside cast long shafts of light into the room. Sometimes, in the periphery of her vision, she thought she saw a figure leaning against the glass, watching. When she would look directly, there was nothing, only the reflection of her own face, pale and strained. Alex grew restless. He spent more and more time in the basement, poring over the notebooks Lumet had left behind. They were filled with sketches of courtroom scenes, fragments of dialogue, philosophical musings about truth and corruption. What unsettled him most was how personal some of the entries felt, half confessions written in a hurried hand, as though Lumet had been trying to unburden himself in secret. Stories hold judgment, but what if the truth refuses to be told? Read one passage, scrawled across an entire page. At night, Alex would return upstairs with his eyes red from exhaustion, muttering lines to himself. Marissa noticed how often he would pause mid-sentence, turning his head as if someone had whispered in his ear. The house itself seemed to react to their presence. as though it had grown aware of them. The wooden floors moaned not just under their steps, but sometimes on their own, in slow, deliberate creaks that echoed down the narrow hallway. The doors, heavy oak that had stood for decades, would tremble faintly in their frames, rattling without cause. The smell of dust and old celluloid film grew stronger in the basement, so much so that it clung to Alex's clothes whenever he came back up. Marissa began to dream vividly. In one dream, she stood in the living room surrounded by a jury of faceless people, while a man's voice asked her over and over, "Do you swear to tell the truth?" She would wake with her throat dry, her heart hammering, the echoes of the question still ringing in her ears. The dreams came often, too often, until she dreaded closing her eyes. The neighbors spoke of the house carefully, always lowering their voices when it came up. One elderly woman who had lived on the block for 40 years told Marissa that during Lumet's final months, she had seen him pacing at all hours, lights on at 3 or 4 in the morning. It was as if he couldn't stop working, the woman said. He looked hunted, like he was chasing something he couldn't catch. Another neighbor, a retired professor, mentioned that the house had always seemed to hold on to sound. He recalled visiting once, years earlier, when Lumet hosted a dinner. Even after the conversation died down, I could swear I heard it lingering, like the words stayed in the air longer than they should have. One evening, after weeks of unease, the couple decided to host a small gathering, a way to break the tension, to reclaim the house as their own. They invited 2 close friends, poured drinks, put on music. For a while, it worked. The living room glowed with the warmth of conversation. But then, in the middle of a story, one of the guests stopped talking and frowned. "Do you hear that?" she asked. The room fell silent. From the walls came the muffled sound of voices, overlapping, as though a heated argument were taking place in the next room. Alex stood quickly and opened the adjoining door, but the study was empty. The voices stopped the moment he stepped inside. The guests laughed nervously, chalking it up to thin walls or the peculiar acoustics of an old townhouse. But the laughter rang hollow, and soon after, they excused themselves, leaving Alex and Marissa alone again in the silence that seemed heavier now, as though the house had punished them for trying to ignore it. In the weeks that followed, Alex's obsession deepened. He spent entire nights in the basement, replaying the old reels, reading the notebooks. Marissa begged him to stop, but he insisted that there was something important hidden in Lumet's private work, something unfinished, something the director had wanted the world to see. One night, long after midnight, Marissa went down to find him. She expected to see him hunched over the projector, but instead found the basement lit only by a dim bulb, the reels spinning silently on the table. Alex stood in the corner, staring at the blank wall, as though watching a film only he could see. When she touched his shoulder, he jumped violently, his face pale. "He's here," Alex whispered. "He's waiting for us to finish it." Marissa looked around the empty basement, the smell of old film and dust thick in the air. "Who's here?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Alex's eyes darted toward the shadows at the far end of the room. "Lumet. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." The weeks stretched on, each day a little heavier than the last. Marissa noticed how her sense of time warped inside the house. Morning light through the tall windows seemed colder, muted, as if filtered through fogged glass. Evenings arrived abruptly, shadows crawling along the narrow stairwell faster than they should. Sometimes she would check the clock, certain only minutes had passed, and find that hours had slipped away. The house seemed to exist in its own rhythm. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but slowly she realized the rooms had a pulse of faint, almost imperceptible pattern of sound and silence, as though the walls themselves breathed. At night, when she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she could feel it most. The slow exhale of pipes, the measured creak of the floorboards, the faintest vibration in the plaster. It was not random. It was deliberate. Alex had abandoned any pretense of normal life. His job, his friends, even his meals fell by the wayside as he spent his hours hunched over Lumet's notebooks. The pages seemed to change under his gaze. Whole lines he swore had not been there before appeared in the margins, scrawled in shaky handwriting. At first he blamed his exhaustion, but the notes were too precise, too direct. One night Marissa caught him at the dining table, scribbling furiously in a notebook. His hands shook as if guided by something beyond his will. When she asked what he was writing, he pushed the book away, refusing to meet her eyes. Later, when she looked, the page was filled with dialogue characters speaking of betrayal, justice, guilt. The last line chilled her. The story doesn't end when the curtain falls. It ends when the truth is told. She slammed the book shut and shoved it back onto the shelf. But by morning it lay open again on the table, the ink smudged as though a hand had pressed against it during the night. By now, the house itself had grown untrustworthy. Doors would not remain where she left them. One evening, Marissa walked into the hallway and froze. The door to the study stood wide open. She distinctly remembered locking it that morning, the heavy brass key still in her pocket. Inside, the room was unchanged except for the air. Colder, damp, as though the house had pulled the warmth from the walls. She closed the door and pressed her back against it, trying to steady her breath. A faint draft whispered against her cheek, though no window was open. She turned and saw that the keyhole glowed faintly in the dark, as though light from another room leaked through. But when she peered into it, there was only blackness, bottomless and absolute. Even the neighbors began avoiding them. The elderly woman who once greeted Marissa on the steps now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. The professor who had spoken fondly of Lumet refused to answer questions about the past. When Alex pressed him one afternoon, he only muttered, "Some stories are too heavy. They don't end when the man dies. They just change hands." The words clung to Marissa's thoughts. She felt it now too that they had inherited more than a building. The house was a vessel, and they were its unwilling custodians. Sleep became impossible. Each night, the disturbances escalated. The voices returned, louder, sometimes breaking into recognizable words. Footsteps paced above their bedroom, steady and measured, always stopping outside their door. Shadows gathered in the corners, too dense to be tricks of light. One early morning, as the first gray light crept through the blinds, Marissa awoke to find Alex sitting upright beside her, his eyes fixed on the doorway. He did not blink. "He's watching," Alex whispered hoarsely. His lips trembled, his skin slick with sweat. Marissa followed his gaze and froze. For the briefest moment, she saw it too. A figure leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, head tilted in silent judgment. Then the hallway was empty again. The basement had become forbidden territory, though Alex refused to stay away. He claimed he could hear something there, a faint rhythm, like the beating of a distant drum. He said it was calling him, urging him to finish what Lumet had left behind. Marissa tried to bar the door one night, stacking boxes against it, but by morning she found Alex downstairs again, surrounded by reels, pages scattered at his feet, muttering lines of dialogue under his breath. When she begged him to stop, his face turned hollow, as if drained of life. "You don't understand," he said. "If we don't finish it, we'll never leave." The words lodged in her chest. "We'll never leave." She realized then that he wasn't speaking in metaphor. The townhouse seemed to close in around them as winter crept over Manhattan. The air inside grew heavy, unmoving, as though the house refused to let the chill outside penetrate its walls. Curtains barely stirred even when windows were cracked. Dust motes lingered in the air long after a hand brushed them aside, as if gravity itself slowed down within the rooms. Marissa began noticing details she couldn't explain. Family photographs, which she had hung carefully in the hallway, tilted slightly every morning, all at the same angle as though someone had passed by during the night, brushing them with a deliberate hand. In the bathroom mirror, her reflection seemed delayed by a fraction of a second, her lips tightening in silent terror before her face caught up. Alex was worse. His skin grew pale from hours spent in the basement, his beard patchy, his voice hoarse. He spoke less and less to her, more and more to the notebooks. She would hear him whispering, sometimes pleading, sometimes arguing. Once, when she went down to confront him, She found the pages arranged across the floor like evidence in a courtroom. Dialogue scribbled in Lumet's unmistakable hand sprawled across them, but now new pages. Alex's handwriting mingled seamlessly. "Do you see?" he asked, his eyes wide, fevered. "It's not mine. It's his. He's still working. I'm just helping." The words chilled her. It wasn't just obsession. It was possession, quiet, creeping, disguised as devotion to art. Marissa's resolve broke one night when the house revealed itself to her in a way that could no longer be rationalized. She had woken at 3 in the morning to the sound of footsteps climbing the stairs. Slow, deliberate, heavy. She reached for Alex, but the bed beside her was cold. The steps reached the landing outside their bedroom, pausing just beyond the closed door. Heart hammering, she slid from the sheets and pressed her ear against the wood. She could hear breathing, a low, steady inhale and exhale, calm as if waiting. With trembling hands, she pulled the door open. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by the glow of the street lamp filtering through the front windows. Empty, but the runner rug beneath her feet had changed. Its fibers were indented, marked by the outline of shoes, fresh, distinct, as though someone had been standing there only moments before. She tried to escape the house by leaving it altogether, spending her days wandering the city. New York bustled with noise, the clamor of taxis, voices spilling out of cafes, construction echoing from every block. Yet even in the noise, she felt stalked by silence. In subway windows, she caught glimpses of a man's reflection, rolled sleeves, stern gaze watching her from across the car, though no one stood there when she turned. At a bookstore on Lexington Avenue, she reached for a biography of Lumet and froze. On the blank inside cover page was handwriting, his handwriting, looping and forceful. "The story is the judgment." She dropped the book, stumbling out onto the street, her breath clouding in the cold. Back inside, Alex was no longer the man she had married. He stopped sleeping in their bed, instead lying on the basement floor surrounded by reels of film that hadn't been projected in decades. When she tried to pull him away, he recoiled, his face gaunt in the flickering light bulb glow. "He wants us to see it," Alex murmured, not looking at her. The last cut, the truth he never showed anyone. Marissa wanted to scream at him, to shake him until he remembered who he was, but her voice caught in her throat. For in that moment, as the bulb above them buzzed faintly, she heard something too. Faint applause, distant yet unmistakable, echoing through the foundation. Not joyous applause, measured, expectant, as if an unseen audience waited for the performance to continue. The house itself began to betray its structure. Hallways stretched longer than they should, the walk from the kitchen to the living room taking twice as many steps as usual. A closet door revealed not the expected shelves, but the narrow frame of another door behind it, sealed shut, as though the house had grown new passageways and then buried them. Late one night, Marissa tried to flee to the guest room for rest. But when she opened the door, it was no longer the guest room. It was the study desk, notebooks, lamp, all arranged exactly as she had left them earlier. She slammed it shut, heart racing, then opened it again. Now it was the bedroom once more. The house was not just haunted. It was shifting, reshaping itself around them, making escape feel like an illusion. And always, there was the sense of being observed. In mirrors, in windows, in the shine of the hallway's polished floorboards. Sometimes she would turn quickly and swear she saw the outline of a man, thin, stern, arms folded, vanishing into the next room. Once, she caught Alex staring into the corner of the living room, silent tears streaking his face. "He's disappointed in us," Alex whispered without prompting. "We're not telling it right." Marissa followed his gaze, but the corner was only shadow. And yet, deep down, she felt it too. A presence not of rage, but of judgment. The weight of a director who had spent his life demanding truth, now pressing that demand from beyond the grave. It ended quietly, without the dramatic crescendo Marissa had braced herself for. One morning she awoke to find the house still, Alex gone from their bed. She followed the faint hum of the basement light and found him sitting on the floor, the old projector casting blank white onto the wall. The reels had run out hours earlier, spinning emptily, but Alex stared on as though the film were still playing. "I saw it," he said softly when she touched his shoulder. "The truth. He showed me." Marissa didn't ask what he meant. She knew she wouldn't understand. Within a week, she packed what little they could carry and left the townhouse behind, leaving the reels and notebooks exactly where they lay. The brownstone remains on the market, unclaimed. Neighbors whisper about the lights that flicker on in the basement some nights, the faint voices that drift from open windows in the early hours. Those who pause too long outside swear they see a man in shirt sleeves leaning in the upstairs window, arms folded, waiting. Sidney Lumet's house has not been abandoned. It is still directing. Only now, there is no audience, only witnesses. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.